Connection Private Limited is a cement manufacturing company that is looking to hire a unit head with a minimum of 9 years of experience to work in one of their largest plants in Chennai. In order for the unit head to successfully complete responsibilities like effectively develop and optimize industrial processes and supervise operations, it is necessary that he or she must have the ability to work well with the other plant employees. The company has completed screening candidates based on functional role requirements and is now assessing behavioral competencies to check if the candidate will be a good organization fit. In this interview, we will see Varun, the regional head, interviewing Faisal on his ability to communicate well with his team, understand goals of the team, and balance personal goals with that of the team. Let's see how the interview goes.
Hey Faisal, good morning. I hope everything is well with you at home and you had no trouble logging into this interview.
Good morning, Varun. No, everything was fine. Thank you for asking. I hope the same with you. I did have a little trouble initially while logging in, but the recruiter, the coordinator helped me out.
Oh, I'm glad it worked out for you. I believe you already spoken to Sudhir from my team, right?
Yes, I did. I spoke to Sudhir.
All right. So at this point, Faisal, do you have a complete clarity of what is the role all about?
Yes, I do. I do have the complete clarity. I've understood it pretty well.
Okay, fantastic. So Faisal, we are going to have a quick 30-minute conversation where I'm going to try to understand more about what you do. So in case you want to get comfortable, get a glass of water or coffee or tea, feel free. Whatever makes you feel relaxed. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm good.
Varun only has half an hour to interview Faisal. Would this be enough time to gather all the relevant information to assess Faisal? Since Varun won't have time to ask more than 3 or 4 questions, along with the right follow-up questions as per the Pro-BO model, let's hope he is well prepared to make most of the time.
Okay, so let's get started. So let me start by asking you, what made you apply for this role?
I like the fact that Connection has a reputation of being a very fast-paced and forward-thinking organization, and I believe that I can contribute to its growth. That's why I applied.
Awesome, fantastic. It's nice to hear such a perspective from you about our company. So where did you work before this, Faisal?
I was working in a company called R&R. It's a steel manufacturing unit.
Oh, okay, fantastic. So what was your role there?
I had joined R&R initially as a unit supervisor, and then within 2 years of my joining, I was promoted as the unit head. We were a team of 13 members, which included production engineers, project managers, assistant unit supervisors, and a unit supervisor. And we also had around 80 plus workers working in the plant.
That's fantastic, right? Such a nice growth. And in fact, the role that we are looking for requires you to work with teams, manage operations, make decisions. So can you tell me about a time that you had to face a challenging situation at work?
Well, I have had quite a few challenging situations during my tenure there. And considering the nature of work, most of the situations were related to resource planning and people management. So there was especially one project which we worked on where the management staff and the workers, they were unable to meet eye to eye. We were running on a very tight delivery schedule, and it was for one of our biggest clients that required everyone on the floor to do OT, overtime. Unfortunately, the deliverables were due on a festival weekend, and the workers refused to do overtime. And we had an extremely difficult time because of that.
That could be quite a challenging situation. Yeah. So can you tell me, how did you motivate a team member?
Looks like Varun started well with a good situational question to understand Faisal's ability to handle people challenges. He seems to have covered the P, or the prevailing situation, of the Pro-BO model. But without asking relevant follow-up questions and knowing if Faisal was able to resolve the issue, Do you think Varun has sufficient information to assess Faisal's behavior in the situation? What if Varun had asked a couple of follow up questions based on the remaining elements of the probe BO model? Let's see how that interview would have looked.
So Faisal, I can understand. And were you directly involved in handling this problem? So weren't your supervisors there to help you?
We actually had a small team handling huge orders at RNR. So it required almost all of us to be pretty hands-on all the time. Additionally, the supervisor who was in charge of this project, he had to take an emergency leave because of a family emergency. And considering the importance of the project, I thought it would be wise for me to step in rather than leave the assistant supervisors and the engineers to do the firefighting.
Interesting.
This answer says a lot about Faisal's work ethic. While the question was straightforward and asked with the intention of understanding Faisal's responsibility in the situation, Faisal's response reveals that he has good leadership qualities and doesn't shy away from taking on additional work when required.
So how did you handle this situation? What were the various options that were available for you?
Given the urgency of the situation, I had only two options. And we could have either convinced the workers to do the overtime on the weekend, or we could have replaced them with some contractual daily wages. Unfortunately, the process of getting the right daily wages and then training them to do the work would have been really time consuming and expensive. So I volunteered to have a conversation with our workers first. I empathized with them, but I also told them that this was a very high paying client. And if we do not get the order completed not within time, then it would lead to losing a huge income, and which may ultimately affect their salaries and bonuses as well. Also, I decided to come in to work that weekend so that I could lead by example.
Nice, nice. So how did you approach this solution?
First, I had my team collect some data regarding the per day productivity of the workers, the value loss from client, and the impact that it can have on the overall performance of the plant. Then I worked with my team to analyze this data and prepared a set of potential objections which we may face. I used this data to talk to influence the workers.
It seems like Varun's comprehensive and open-ended style of questioning is allowing Faisal to divulge a lot of information about himself. Varun's questions are in line with the O or the options of the Pro-BO model. By answering these questions, Faisal has showcased his ability to delegate as well as be hands-on depending on what the situation calls for. Also, by dissecting Faisal's actions, Varun should be able to understand the B or the behaviors displayed by Faisal while resolving the issue. Examining the situation further will help Varun understand what the eventual outcome of Faisal's actions were.
Nice, nice. And what was the outcome of the situation?
Gladly, I'm happy to say that we managed to get the workers on board and get the consignment ready on time. Post this situation, we ensured that we always have one representative from the worker union as part of the project planning and designing stage. This would ensure that their interests are also well represented, and we avoided any similar situations in the future projects.
Nice. So I'm glad to hear that. But let me ask this question. What if the workers were not convinced with your statistical approach? What other options would you have tried out?
It looks like Varun wants to thoroughly assess Faisal's thought process and behaviors by questioning him further on what else he could have done to resolve the issue. Varun is trying to explore the alternate behaviors or the B from the Pro-BO model.
There were a few other things I could have attempted to convince the workers. I could have spoken to the one or two more influential members of the workers union separately, and then I would have asked them to convince I would have convinced them first about the urgency of the situation, and then I would ask them to convince the remaining workers. I could have also offered some perks to the workers, like extra vacation days or probably company sponsored lunch to coax them into doing an overtime.
Mhm.
If all else failed, we would have had to incur the additional cost and probably hire contractual workers from outside.
All right, fantastic. And what do you think the outcome would have been if you had chosen this alternate route?
If I would have used the first approach of using one or two influential members from the workers' union, then they would have complied for sure. But the lack of transparency between the management and the entire workers' union, that may have led to a tense work atmosphere and probably some lack of loyalty on behalf of the other workers. And in the second situation, the second scenario that I explained, we could have managed to get the job done, but getting the perks means unnecessary additional expense to the company.
Faisal's answers that showcase the alternative behavior and outcome of the situation seems to give Varun a keen insight into how deeply Faisal had analyzed the situation before acting. Let's go back to the original interview and pick it up from where Varun had asked Faisal a question about motivating a teammate.
So Faisal, so quick question, how did you motivate your teammate? Can you give me an example of how you did this?
Sure. There was an interesting situation. We had an assistant unit supervisor who had a work experience of 5 years, out of which 3 years he was working at R&R. And he was due for a promotion to the position of unit supervisor. But we were not very sure if he was ready for the step up role. And he was quite unhappy with our decision to not promote him. And he started underperforming at his work. I could understand why he would be demotivated to perform, and I tried to reach out.
Interesting. So Faisal, it sounds like something that his supervisor will do, right? So what made you step into this?
Actually, I was on the panel which interviewed this guy and hired him. So I felt a sense of personal responsibility in his success or his growth in the company. Also, I personally knew this employee and his work from the time he had joined, and he didn't have the required leadership skills to become a unit supervisor, but he was a very diligent worker. So I thought I should step in and, give him that chance.
Varun seems to be on the right track with these questions, trying to understand the prevailing situation and the responsibilities that Faisal had or felt he had in this situation.
So what options did you have to improve his performance?
The first step was to go and speak with him regarding his problems. What was the reason behind the sudden performance drop? Was it only because he did not receive the promotion, or were there any additional problems added to it? Once I had that cleared, I explained the reason to him about the decision to not promote him. And I also charted out some developmental courses and opportunities which would help him grow.
Fantastic.
Looks like Varun is asking all the right follow-up questions. He looked into the options available to Faisal to handle the situation in detail. If Varun analyzes Faisal's answers further, he will also be able to gauge the B or the behaviors displayed by Faisal and his ability to empathize with teammates and take genuine efforts to help them.
Fantastic. So Faisal, can you tell me about a time when you and your team worked on a project that failed?
Looks like Varun has dropped the ball right at the end. While he does ask excellent questions until now, do you think he will have the complete picture until he finds out the eventual outcome of the situation and insight into Faisal's thought process? Let's look at an alternate scenario where Varun does ask a couple of additional follow-up questions.
Seems like you get quite invested in your team members. Were you able to help your colleague? What was the outcome, Faisal?
Thankfully, yes. We reviewed his performance again after 6 months after my conversation with him. And based on his performance, we decided to promote him. He is currently one of the unit supervisor. He is currently one of the unit supervisors at RNR.
That's wonderful. So Faisal, I'm just curious, what is it you would have done if you had to sit down and hadn't worked and had continued underperforming?
Well, I would have scheduled a few more meetings with him, sent him to specific training programs, and given him the time and the place for improvement. I would have also spoken to his immediate manager and asked him to be a little more hands-on with him. I may have also taken it a step further and started mentoring him on the areas that he was facing difficulties with. I would have looped in a few of his colleagues as well so that he receives constant support while he's working.
Okay, sure. So do you think that would have led to the outcome that you would have wanted?
Hopefully, yes. But despite our best efforts, if the underperformance continued, then we would have known that this was a behavioral issue. And considering that he was performing quite well before, in that case, we would have had to let him go. But I'm glad that we did not have to resort to that.
By asking specific questions, Varun got the opportunity to take a peek into Faisal's mind and understand his behaviors better. By aligning his questions with the final B and O of the Pro-BO model, Varun understood that Faisal truly cares about his teammates and would go above and beyond to help them do what's best for them. But it also became evident that he isn't a pushover, and if the situation demanded it, he was more than capable of making difficult decisions. Let's get back to the original interview and the question Varun had asked on the failed project. This seems like a good question if the intent is to gauge the candidate's self-awareness and their ability to learn from their mistakes. Therefore, it would seem that it is very important for a question like this to be explored further and followed through as per the complete Pro-BO framework to really understand the candidate's self-awareness as well as their ability to learn.
So Faisal, tell me about a project that you and your teammate had worked which resulted in failure.
I had a team working on developing a new lean manufacturing process, and that was to reduce the waste and maximize the revenue in the unit. I was quite invested in the project, considering that I had a special interest in that, and I was working very closely with the team. We had given ourselves 3 months to work on it, and our target was to reduce the wastage by 15% by the end of it. Unfortunately, we weren't even close to our goal at the end of the project.
And why is that? Why do you think you were not able to meet the goals?
The goal that we had taken was quite challenging, and the process was also quite challenging. Although it was not impossible to achieve, the problem was that we clearly didn't define and track our responsibilities through the project, resulting in a lot of miscommunication within the team. There was also some conflict regarding accountability and a lack of ownership, which ultimately led to us failing in achieving the goal. Since then, we have tried to be a little more careful about how we track responsibilities during a project.
Varun details the P or the prevailing situation a little more to understand the context and background in which they were operating. This should give him a better perspective on the real reason for such a failure.
So Faisal, that's all the questions I had for today that I wanted to ask. Do you have any questions for me?
No, as of now, I don't. Be a little more hands-on with him. I may have also taken it a step further and started mentoring him on the areas that he was facing difficulties with. I would have looped in a few of his colleagues as well so that he receives constant support while he's working.
Okay, sure. So do you think that would have led to the outcome that you would have wanted?
Hopefully, yes. But despite our best efforts, if the underperformance continued, then we would have known that this was a behavioral issue. And considering that he was performing quite well before, in that case, we would have had to let him go. But I'm glad that we did not have to resort to that.
By asking specific questions, Varun got the opportunity to take a peek into Faisal's mind and understand his behaviors better. By aligning his questions with the final B and O of the Pro-BO model, Varun understood that Faisal truly cares about his teammates and would go above and beyond to help them do what's best for them. But it also became evident that he isn't a pushover, and if the situation demanded it, he was more than capable of making difficult decisions. Let's get back to the original interview and the question Varun had asked on the failed project. This seems like a good question if the intent is to gauge the candidate's self-awareness and their ability to learn from their mistakes. Therefore, it would seem that it is very important for a question like this to be explored further and followed through as per the complete Pro-BO framework to really understand the candidate's self-awareness as well as their ability to learn.
So Faisal, tell me about a project that you and your teammate had worked, which resulted in failure.
I had a team working on developing a new lean manufacturing process, and that was to reduce the waste and maximize the revenue in the unit. I was quite invested in the project, considering that I had a special interest in that, and I was working very closely with the team. We had given ourselves 3 months to work on it, and our target was to reduce the wastage by 15% by the end of it. Unfortunately, we weren't even close to our goal at the end of the project.
And why is that? Why do you think you were not able to meet the goals?
The goal that we had taken was quite challenging, and the process was also quite challenging. Although it was not impossible to achieve, the problem was that we clearly didn't define and track our responsibilities through the project, resulting in a lot of miscommunication within the team. There was also some conflict regarding accountability and a lack of ownership, which ultimately led to us failing in achieving the goal. Since then, we have tried to be a little more careful about how we track responsibilities during a project.
Varun details the P or the prevailing situation a little more to understand the context and background in which they were operating. This should give him a better perspective on the real reason for such a failure.
So Faisal, that's all the questions I had for today that I wanted to ask. Do you have any questions for me?
No, as of now, I don't. Thank you.
Once again, despite a good beginning, Varun hasn't asked sufficient follow-up questions to assess Faisal fairly. Without understanding the actions taken by Faisal in the situation and the impact of this instance in future projects, his only takeaway is that Faisal has difficulty defining and tracking responsibilities. But is that the case? Let's see what Varun could have learned if he had asked a couple more follow-up questions.
So could you be more specific about how you handle this miscommunication?
When the project failed, naturally everybody started to blame each other. I went through the email threads to understand where we went wrong. And I realized that only some of the conversations were captured on email. And a lot of the emails started with, as discussed with you, which clearly meant that they were happening outside a formal setup and not getting captured. And thus, because of the lack of documentation, a lot of confusions were created.
Candidates typically have a tendency to use the word we. It is important to identify the role played specifically by the candidate in the situation described so as to measure his or her ability. The purpose of the question was to understand the R or the responsibilities that Faisal had of having to identify the miscommunication.
Okay. And what options did you have to rectify the situation?
The ultimate aim was to create a communication structure that would help us track everyone's responsibility and action items in a comprehensive manner. There were several options or ways of doing this, including having frequent meetings to discuss the project status and individual responsibilities, and having each team member writing detailed emails on their individual action items to everyone, uh, and doing this on a regular basis. I came to a conclusion that most efficient and transparent way to track responsibilities would be to create a shared document which clearly shows you the defined tracker responsibilities. And I personally was very instrumental in designing that tracker format.
The answer to this question has provided a lot of insight into Faisal's thought process. While the question was asked with the intention of understanding the various options available and considered by Faisal before he chose to carry out a specific action, his thought process also displays his B or behavior. Faisal seems to have an eye for detail, knack for organization, and ability to visualize the requirements to work with a team that he exhibited.
So first I have two questions. So what was the outcome of the incident? And more importantly, what was your key takeaway from this?
The importance of communication, the importance of structure and planning. This was the most important takeaway. And since this incident, for every project we work on, we made it a point to have a discussion and clear division of responsibilities right at the beginning of the project. We also ensured that we kept an updated tracker to ensure that everyone on the team was on the same page and to lend support whenever required.
Considering how Varun asked a question about a failed project to understand if there was a tendency to miscommunicate, the original outcome seems to be quite clear. However, by asking about the takeaway, looks like Varun is trying to understand the E or the eventual outcome of the responsibilities undertaken by Faisal to address this issue.
Sure, Faisal. But as with all these projects and deadlines, as it is pretty overwhelming. So what if your team member did not fill these trackers?
Yeah, if I started noticing noticing a lag in filling the tracker, I would have included additional mandatory weekly meetings and periodic reviews to ensure that everyone was on the same page. I would have also insisted that the team records all their conversation, whether it happens over video conferencing, over telephone, over email, so that we have documentation to, to the complete effect.
Pretty interesting. So how do you think your team would have received this?
I'm sure there would have been initial resistance, but the team thankfully understood the importance of communication and accountability. So they eventually would have gotten accustomed to the new routine.
These questions on the alternate behavior and outcome led to the revelation that Faisal was prepared to handle any challenges that may have come up from his initial solution. While it seems that Varun was asking good questions to understand the prevailing situation, by not completing the Pro-BO framework and asking the right follow-up questions, do you think he was doing justice to his initial questions? In the absence of the right follow-up questions, Varun was only getting partial information on Faisal's past performance. He seems to be walking away with first impressions or first responses to the questions he had asked, and as a result, quite possibly would have rejected Faisal's application. Considering the high level for which Varun was interviewing, it was important for him to press on and understand Faisal's behavior in the most detailed manner he could. Had Varun asked the additional follow-up questions, he could have gathered the necessary information and learned that Faisal had demonstrated the behavior required to work well in a team. It is important to follow through the complete Pro-BO framework and ask the right follow-up questions to truly determine a candidate's past performance and use that as a prediction for future behavior.